They have a big Cardano event there as well, and bring a lot of the Cardano community, especially DApp developers, the foundations, and others. A lot more to say on our efforts with the VC side. So many of you know about the C Fund, and it's trying to take positions and help out people in the DeFi ecosystem of Cardano. We'd also like to replicate that for geography-specific funds, starting with Africa. So not much to say today, but we will certainly have more to say in the coming months on that. In terms of other updates, science is progressing pretty quickly. There's going to be a blog post imminently on pipelining, and then there's going to be a follow-up blog post in a few weeks, probably on input endorsers. I was kind of hoping to get the input endorsers blog put out in February, but it looks like that's more of a Marchy thing. But generally speaking, it'll kind of outline design principles, challenges, and why these things are interesting, and what value they have for scalability. And then some papers will come to follow. Pipelining doesn't have a paper because it's not novel from a scientific viewpoint, but input endorsers actually are. And I think they bring a lot to the story. So I believe it's real good to have the community have access to that. And this is one of those areas where it's a major leap forward in terms of scale and performance. We kind of worked our way up to it. The company wrote the parallel chains paper, and then also introduced the concept of input endorsers in the original Ouroboros paper. And then if you guys are really astute about our publications, you would have noticed the Ledger Redux paper as well. So the corpus has kind of been moving and stacking and moving and stacking towards a direction, but you have to put a design on the table. And this is the first time where we've kind of pulled the threads together for a particular design that doesn't suffer from problems with DDoS attacks and so forth. It turns out it's a tricky problem, but the good news is we have a pretty good idea of that. And now it's just translating it to engineering speak for the post-fossil hard forks to roll out. So that's going to be a lot of fun to talk about. Another big event that is imminent, so it's coming this month and next month, is the launch of Mamba. Now, Mamba has been in the works for years. It's the Ethereum Classic code base that we took and ported and modified, put OBFT on top of, and now are bringing to Cardano. And what Mamba is it's an introduction to the entire sidechain strategy for Cardano. So many of you know, the paper I wrote back in 2016, the Why Cardano, talked about this idea of the Cardano settlement layer and then the Cardano control or computation layer. We kind of use both terms in the documentation. But basically the idea is that the settlement layer would establish a root of trust, be very safe and very effective, and built in a way that it could easily spin up these computation layers that would have different computational and accounting models. So the biggest difference between us and Ethereum is we use extended UTXO and Plutus. Ethereum uses Solidity and EVM. It's an accounts-based model. Okay, so you can try to emulate that on the base ledger, but it adds a lot of unnecessary bloat and complexity and attack vectors. So it makes a lot more sense to run a sidechain. So for years, we've been chasing different ideas of how to operationalize that, what technological foundation should it be under. We looked a lot at the K framework, for example, and other ideas. But Mamba is really the first time, I'd say, in the project's history where we've converged to a point where we have a very crystallized viewpoint of not only how to connect the chains together, how to operate the sidechain, but then also a generic footprint that if you, the user, want to create your own sidechain, how that process works. Now, why this is so exciting for stake pool operators and people who run the sidechains is that it actually creates separate revenue streams. If you have sidechains, they can have their own tokens and tokenomics. And if you're a stake pool operator and you're operating not just Cardano, but also the sidechains, means that you'll actually get multiple tokens in your revenue stream for running your consensus node, which is real exciting if you think about it. So there's certainly a lot to come in the next 60 days about that story. And throughout the year, you kind of see this stuff roll out. Milkomeda kind of demonstrated already how a third party would do that. And then obviously the Mamba approach is a different way, and hopefully the canonical way, because it's made an abstraction so many people can follow that. Future chains will be things like, for example, the Catalyst voting network. That's run the Jormungandr code. It'll converge the same type of technology that Mamba has, and then it'll be a sidechain of Cardano and run by Cardano. And hopefully you, the community, will launch lots of these things. So look for that as well. We should have a lot more to say at Consensus about it. We'll do some presentations, and we'll have some of the people who are core parts of that team come out and kind of play around with it. Also, it means you'll be able to do hackathons in both Plutus as well as Solidity and EVM. So it's really up to you to decide what programming model makes the most sense. It's a bittersweet thing when you look at all the progress that's made and where we're at. It's bittersweet from the perspective that we're almost done with the original vision of all the things one would need for a third generation cryptocurrency. And it's a beautiful vision. It's been a long road. It's been a lot of work. Never in my wildest dreams did I imagine that we would have made so much progress and solved so many amazing problems. And now the next phase, when you say things like self-determination, self-governance, means that it's going to be as much you, if not more so, than it is anything I could ever come up with. So I'm excited to work with you guys in the community. I'm excited to see where these open source project structures grow. As many of you know, I'm a huge supporter of floss. We have a policy here at IO not to pursue intellectual property. We've never, despite the fact publishing 130 papers, filed for a patent. And all our software that I'm aware of is under some form of open source license. If we ever release it in a public repo, I mean, there's obviously code that we write internally, but we always end up open sourcing it at some point. So we believe in that. But it's one thing to say others can take it and do what they will. It's another thing to say, let's work with others towards a common goal and build. And that requires a different mindset, management structure, mentality. It also requires an acknowledgement that things may be a little tougher when it's just a small group of people, or you can get everybody in a room, eat a pizza with them and talk it out. You can get things done fast. But when you talk about millions of people and trying to give everybody a voice, that's a difficult one. And that's something that requires a lot of more advanced governance tools and strategies. And in my view, that is the ultimate USP of Cardano. No matter how smart your founder is or capable, they all have their flaws and they all have their benefits, but no one is smarter than everyone, and no one is more capable than everyone. So the better job we do at bringing the community together and giving a solid governance and operational structure and a good bureaucracy for the open source project that is effective, the faster we can converge to brilliance. Now, there is a cost to that. The longer you invest in giving everybody a voice means the slower things come out. So there's always a balancing act between agility and speed and inclusivity and due diligence of ideas. So the good news is that we're not doing this alone. There's more than 40 years of history about distributed open source projects. In the last 20 years in particular, I'd like to believe enormous progress has been made, as demonstrated by the fact that the majority of infrastructure that we use in the world is based on open source software. And despite the fact that people are in great conflict at times with each other, there's nothing in the world that I know of that can bring the whole world together quite like open source software. So hopefully this week will give a lot of clarity. We've retrained a small legion of experts. We've gotten a lot of consultants in who've done this a lot to kind of help us along. And it is really exciting to see the transformation of Cardano towards that end. And it's also exciting to see merging that with Catalyst, because you have built in all these amazing voting tools and a treasury system, which means that you have the holy grail of open source. You have a place where people feel like they have a voice. You have a place where people can actually get things done. And you have a place where funding can materialize that is truly objective and pure. A lot of institutions have to be formed moving forward, some community-oriented and other ones just to counterbalance actors. Research institutions, execution institutions, standards bodies. Some will be embedded within existing, some will be blue ocean and created. And there's already a lot of work in the community in creating things like the Cardano DeFi Alliance, for example, and other alliances are coming that cover core pieces of technology in the Cardano ecosystem that, in my view, are essential for Cardano to carry out its mission of becoming the financial operating system for those who don't have one. Those alliances will be community-led and supported, of course, by us. I'm going to be cutting a lot personally grants to these different alliances. And I know the foundation has the intention to do the same. It's just a question of when and how and the exact strategy behind that, which is one of the topics that will come up inevitably. But it's exciting, nonetheless, to see that the community is rising up and they're getting things done. You see, it's impossible to keep everybody happy. Things like protocol parameters, things like K, A naught, these things. There's great debates about what they should be at, how things should work. For example, the Curve pledge, was it SIP 007? This is an example of great, well thought out work. However, when you measure it, it looks like it does reduce the Nakamoto coefficient of Cardano. But the burden is upon the process to explain why and how. And the burden is upon the process to use these great ideas and improve them to a point where they accomplish the same thing. One of the things that we've been pushing for example, are objective metrics, because we like objectivity here. We like inclusive accountability here. It's very important to me. It's very important to the project. In particular, you will hear again and again and again that people say we need to be more decentralized. But nobody knows what decentralized means. What is it? What's the measurement? Is it like a graphics card with 3D Mark? Can you just like run a benchmark and say, okay, you're 27 and that's better than 14 or something like that? We don't have such a metric. And then there also isn't a good metric of throughput. I remember Alex Chirpinoy with Dan Friedman months ago demonstrating a transaction on Ergo that had 5,000 outputs. Simulating that transaction in an account style model like Ethereum would take many, many transactions, likely hundreds to thousands. And that's one transaction in that system. So we look at TPS and we say, oh, well, that's a metric. But if one can do thousands of transactions in one shot and the other one is very serial, TPS doesn't seem like it's a very good metric, any more so than clock speed is anymore in a processor. As a child in the 90s and 2000s, I remember the processor wars between Intel and AMD, and how every week we're 1.2 gigahertz, we're 1.4 gigahertz. They'd always find a way to get the clock speed a little higher. And we as consumers were trained to think more is better. Then suddenly you had chips that were 3.4 gigahertz that were slower than chips that were 2 gigahertz. There was more to the story about these things in practice, as we've learned now with custom silicon like Apple Silicon and multi-core processors and special purpose cores for image processing and AI and so forth. Well, analogously, there's more to the story about blockchain performance. And what I'm very keen to start studying and understanding are the trade-offs. So as we move towards an open source project, people have to ask baseline questions. This change, this enhancement, this strategy, what does this ultimately do for the real world performance and throughput of the system as a whole? And what does this do with the level of decentralization for the system as a whole? Every change moving forward, it has to be scored against at least those two ideas. And the third idea, the self-verification, the inclusive accountability concept, does this change compromise your ability as a user to verify things about the system? As it stands right now, people often ask, why is Daedalus so slow? Well, Daedalus is a lot of software. It's not a wallet. Daedalus is a server. It's a database. Daedalus is the Cardano protocol. It's running the whole stack. You're running a full node. So anyone who has a copy of that has a full copy of the Cardano blockchain. And you can see in our infancy already how heavy that can be. The point of technology like Mithril is to give you the ability to have the same level of security that that experience has, but be able to operate with a light client. However, will that be ported to all sidechains? Right now, under the current sidechains we're planning, the answer seems to be yes. It seems that that technology could work on those chains. But what if we take more exotic technology? Perhaps not. And that's something that you, the community, are going to become increasingly more involved in, to the extent that eventually difficult decisions have to be made. Every single time you do something with the technology that's been built moving forward after this year is done, there's ultimately a question of, is this going to increase or decrease decentralization? Is this going to increase or decrease system performance and throughput for the classes of applications we tend to care about? And ultimately, does this make the system more inclusive or more exclusive? More participation, less participation, more ability to verify transactions that are sent and operate light node infrastructure with full node security, or less? Are we centralizing fundamentally? Every change has to be scored this way. So this is a big item in the open source project that we've been discussing, and it's something that we care deeply about, to the extent that when we talk about founding institutions, some of those institutions embedded in academia and embedded in standards bodies will be focused on creating objective metrics, not just for Cardano, but for the industry as a whole. So we can, for the first time ever, be able to know where Cardano officially stacks up against Ethereum and Solana and EOS and all these other systems. We have crude metrics like Nakamoto coefficients, for example, but they don't accurately reflect the nuances of these protocols. And it's about time we had some rigor behind it. The good news is this is a problem that's very collaborative in nature, and it's something that everybody has an incentive to talk about. And frankly, we as consumers, we need to level up a little bit. We can't just demand raw performance at the cost of principles and philosophy. We have to demand performance while maintaining our principles and philosophy. And we can't just demand a system where we leave people behind. I shared Moxie Marlinspike's article for good reason, because a lot of Web3 is actually just Web2 and Web3 clothing, highly centralized upon with infrastructure that people like JP Morgan own. And the more centralized it is, the easier it's going to be for this space to become co-opted. We've already seen the politics of personal destruction enter this space. We've already seen all kinds of shenanigans with governments around the world doing things, both implicitly and explicitly. Now in China, I think you can have jail time for trading cryptocurrencies. And that's just one of hundreds of examples. So it's very important that we ask ourselves, what are we actually trying to accomplish? That brings me to my final point, which is the kind of a constitution or a Bill of Rights or some fundamental principles. They've always been implicit in why Cardano and in the Cardano community, and Bitcoin has them implicit in the code. And if one was asked, what are the principles and values of Bitcoin? And a lot of people would say things like the monetary policy, for example. There will only ever be 21 million Bitcoin. Put their hand on the table. No monetary policy changes, ever. Ethereum does change its monetary policy with EIP 1559 and others, and more to come. And that's fine, but that's a philosophical difference between these two ecosystems. One of the least developed areas, in addition to metrics, is the idea of meta governance, constitutions, the idea that blockchains need some form of governing principles that are explicitly there and understood. Some of you know, I invested 20 million to Carnegie Mellon University to set up a center for formal mathematics. One of the things that the center is trying to do, and it's somewhat analogous to where we're at as an ecosystem, is it's trying to capture mathematics as mathematicians understand it, which is built to communicate to other mathematicians, and make it machine understandable. So take things that were in LaTeX or handwritten, things that exist in presentation code, but not in code that a machine can have an opinion on, and get it constructively to a point where a machine could understand it. Now, this is one of the hardest things you can do, and it's the first time math has gone for a major rewrite in 120 years since David Hilbert. And the rest of the gang were running around like Gödel and Turing and so forth. Now, Analogously, there's a question of how much should the ethics, the integrity, the soul, the intentions of the system be machine understandable? Because if they're machine understandable, you can then build protocols that can actually operate on the intent and embed them as kind of a regulator of the system for all smart contracts. This comes up a lot in the privacy space. People want confidentiality and privacy, but at the same time, they don't really like the consequences of confidentiality and privacy in certain areas. So while we would love to see dissidents in Russia who are protesting the war in Ukraine have a system that gives them the ability to uh, freely associate and get funding and be able to express themselves and resist the government, at the same time, many people wouldn't like that same set of tools being used for child sex trafficking or terrorist financing. You see, same technology. So governance of these systems is very important. And you can't just trust a government, because if you trust the United States, for example, the same backdoors, the same process will inevitably be used by Russia or Iran or another government, China. You see, so these are complicated things. And the level of machine understandability of the ethics of the system, the intent of the system are very important. Cardano is right up there with all of the best in class smart contracting systems. As the expressivity of the system grows, and as we add sidechains, every person who has something becomes a subset of Cardano, which effectively means that Cardano will eventually have more capabilities, in my view, than any other cryptocurrency, because we can, like the Borg, just absorb their technology over time. When we have all of that, because we have all these capabilities, millions of people will come in and use this technology in different ways. Some ways good, some ways not so good. Many people ask me, where did the name Cardano come from? It was Girolamo Cardano. Now, I picked him for good reason, because he wasn't a good person, but he wasn't a bad person. He was a nuanced person of the Italian Renaissance. Brilliant mathematician. He was a doctor, also a complete scoundrel. And he invented pieces of probability theory for gambling. He was the Pope's private physician, but also excommunicated from the church. He was a very interesting fellow, and I felt that was an appropriate name for a cryptocurrency. Sometimes cryptocurrencies are bad. Sometimes cryptocurrencies are good. And in our love and rush to embrace this new technology, we must be intellectually honest and wise enough to acknowledge the times that they are bad. The point of regulating structures are to figure out how do you blunt that. And we don't need a government or a regulator to do that. We can use the very same things that make a blockchain a trusted custodian, things like smart contracts and so forth. So the meta point of this governance experiment, as we move into this complete open source project throughout this year and build all these institutions, is a deep conversation about the Bill of Rights of Cardano, the Constitution of Cardano, the fundamental things that are difficult or damn near impossible to change, and making sure that those are established well and they're machine understandable to the extent where Cardano itself can then enforce that as people attempt to change it and update it for the future. This is probably the most ambitious part and most dangerous part of the Cardano project. We go from writing papers in science to things like real hard engineering to unsolved problems that may never fully be solved. There is no government in the world people are universally happy with. There is no policy or person so beloved that it is considered beyond reproach. Humans like diversity, which is why we have many languages, many cultures, many religions, and it's not going to change anytime soon. So no matter what we end up converging to, some people won't be happy. But if we do a good job, at least those people will be heard and still have a voice and still have a say, and probably can still use the technology of Cardano for the things that they care about. That's the great challenge before us. So it's been a hell of a ride, and that's why it's so bittersweet. You know, everything changes, and you get to make sequels, but it's never quite the same as the original movie. And that's okay. And I know that we can get this done, though, because I got all of you. And there's a lot of really brilliant people in this community. We've built a relationship over the last 6 years. I'm never going to stop the AMAs. I'm never going to stop broadcasting live from warm, sunny Colorado, sometimes other places. Hell, I might even go to space one of these days. We got too many people that are in those circles for them not to sell me a ticket on one of those rockets. But despite all the shenanigans and the ups and downs and the craziness and just the daily grind, what makes this job so special and what makes everything so special is the fact that I really do get to work with the best people. And we're all on a mission together. We ultimately, at this company, want to improve the systems of the world for everyone everywhere. It's what we've always tried to set out to do. Come October, I'm going back to Bermuda. Many of you got on this boat either with the whiteboard video in 2017 or the TED Talk from 2014 that I did. That TED Talk in 2014, I made a lot of commitments and promises. I wrote a check that I didn't quite have the cash, the money to cash. I said, this technology is going to go change the developing world and bring economic identity to everybody. 8 years later, when we look back at all of this, it is really remarkable and amazing that it looks like we can actually cash that check now. The tech